All right. Good morning. And I am super excited today to have a different sort of guest on the show. We've had a lot of folks from the Nostr community recently, which has been awesome. But today I am thrilled to welcome Mr. Jack Hart to the show, the author of Brave New World, a fantastic book that I read last month. And I was telling him it's rare that I read a book where I think, wow, this guy, he gets it. He sees the big picture of where evolution, society, technology are going. And I think Jack is one of those people. So, Jack, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for agreeing to chat.
Hey, it's great to be here, Max. Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to it.
Right on. So, I thought we would start, as we were mentioning just before hopping on record here, you touch on a number of interesting topics around technology, around evolution, and there's so many. I'm sure we could fill many hours of this. But I think maybe one place I'd like to start is, you talk a lot about this concept of high strangeness and the idea that everything seems to be accelerating. We have everything. I think everyone can feel over the last decade, things just seem to be getting weirder and weirder culturally, politically. The sort of singularity that people have been talking about seems to be approaching technologically. I guess my first question to you is, what is going on in the world? What is high strangeness, and where are we heading? Is this unique, or is this something that humanity has always experienced?
That's a topic that I've been exploring for decades, and so it's not a short answer. But I would just describe to you, being a little bit longer in the tooth than yourself. I was around during the personal computer revolution, and I was interested in technology as it sprang up from DOS day, from very crude interface days, and in that process, and the foundation of my online presence and my personal interested research, I had started a website called Technostics. And so that's a compound word, and it using the first half of the compound word is tech, meaning technology, and the second half Gnostics, which is taken from the biblical era heretical sects known as Gnosticism, or Gnostics. They didn't call themselves that, but they were called that by their detractors of the time, the Roman Empire. However, the sense being a blend of technology and a sense of spiritualism, or as the Gnostics described their own version of that, intuitively derived knowledge. And so the name Technostics essentially represents a balance of artifact and epiphany. And so utilizing our technologies as a tool, as humans have always done, these dang opposable thumbs have gotten us in trouble for, eons. But using our technologies in a compatible way, in a social way, because we are social creatures. But I also consider us to be spiritual creatures in that we are interested in the etheric realm as well as the material worlds. And Gnosticism fit that criterion quite nicely as a technology itself, technology of the mind and the soul. So that was kind of the genesis. And so I've always approached the explorations of our cultures through that balanced filter. So to get closer to your question, back in the 80s, and I go through, and part of the purpose of the book is to really outline the historic factors of high strangeness or high weirdness, and some very obscure, little known yet greatly impactful elements of that. And so it is, our modern era is, our postmodern world is absolutely tied to our technologies. And so back when I was first exploring the newfangled personal computer revolution, some triggers, some cosmic triggers, I call them in the book, occurred that really sparked and drove a culture that I describe as, or more precisely, a cultural marker that I describe as high weirdness or high strangeness. I prefer high strangeness. The term was coined by what's the guy's name? The UFO researcher Jay Hynek. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but back in the post World War II, the world was gripped in a modernization of an ancient mythology. It became known as the UFO craze, and so J. Allen Hynek, he actually, as a researcher that was researching the UFO phenomena for the United States government, he addressed the United Nations in describing what the UFO phenomena. And just give me a moment to just briefly outline what that phenomena looked like in 1948. So World War II, the world was gripped in a world war. It was a high technology war for the time, and much of the fighting was occurring in the airspace with Axis and Allied fighter planes and bombers. Obviously, the delivery system of the atomic bomb was driven by the bombers. So in that era, the Axis fighters were of course Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Allied forces were the United States, Great Britain, the occupied Europe, and Russia. That's a different topic. So as the air war was pursued, both the pilots from both the Axis and the Allied forces were describing these strange orbs of light that would follow them in their dogfights, or follow the bomber planes in their bomber missions, darting around doing seemingly impossible aerial acrobatics. And they nicknamed, the fighter pilots themselves nicknamed these orbs of light Foo Fighters.
Oh, interesting.
Which of course is the name taken by the remnants of Kurt Cobain's band. But so post World War II, now, so also in some of my earlier works, I identify the dropping of the atomic bombs as a cosmic trigger that really threw us into the modern world of high strangeness. And there's a lot of components to that. However, back to the story at hand, post World War II, governments all over the world were interested in what was going on, because right after the war is when we started having essentially the UFO craze, where people were spotting UFOs everywhere. Most famously, I know you're down in San Francisco, and I'm up in Oregon, but most famously there were the string of lights that were seen over Mount Rainier, and that is where the term UFO was coined. So when J. Allen Hynek addressed the United Nations in describing the phenomena of ufology in its infancy at that time, he described it as a highly strange phenomena that really needed to be taken seriously, and was driven by forces beyond traditional comprehension. So that's where the terminology of high strangeness, or high weirdness, if you will, came about. That was the genesis of it. And our culture, exploded with the computer chip and with the technology post World War II, and has been accelerating ever since. We touched base on Terence McKenna's whole concept of the time wave zero. And so back in the 80s, there was a real spiritual drive toward that whole concept, and it was the 2012 prophecies.
Right.
And so that whole thing was driven by actually old Mayan cuneiform pictographs from the Palenque ruins in Mexico. But there was a omega point that was being described as 2012 being the trigger point, the end point. Terence McKenna added his technological, his machine elf version of the 2012 prophecy into time wave zero. And so the high strangeness, that was a component of it. It was driven by a perceived acceleration of technological and sociological factors. Certain facets, and I get into the book, we can talk about some of them if you'd like, but there were certain trigger factors and facets of high strangeness that really, although small at the time, became major components of our postmodern culture that has essentially driven us to the brink where high strangeness has become the predominant paradigm of our culture. And just recently on in my weblog, I've been doing a series basically describing from the parapolitical realm that those laggard facets of our culture known as politicians finally have caught up with the idea of high strangeness, to where now suddenly the two predominant political factions, the Republicans and the Democrats, have been calling each other weird. And there it is. It's just, it's finally filtered down to the great laggards of our culture, the politicians. So,
I love it.
Anyway.
Well, that brings up so many interesting things. But I guess one question is, you mentioned Terence. I'm a huge fan of Terence. You also mentioned the Mayan ruins. Interestingly, I actually used to live in Mexico for a long time. And so
nice.
I'm very interested in Mexico and all the ancient cultures there. So do you think that, part of Terence's whole, I guess, deal was there was this eschaton, this end of history, omega point, whatever. The Mayans obviously had the 2012 thing. What was that? I mean, do you think that's all part of the same narrative of the singularity and sort of accelerationism into this point? Or do you think that, no, actually, this is just the way it always has been? All humans have felt this, or something else?
It would be comforting to think that it's always been that way. And facets of that, absolutely, things have always been strange,
right.
And they don't become strange until you notice them. And then once you notice them, then you start seeing them everywhere. Right. Just like VW bugs, once you buy a VW bug, now you see them on the road everywhere. And so and like synchronicity, the more you know, the more you will know. The more you see, the more you will see. So high strangeness has always been with us. But with that said, in our culture, it's hard to deny the acceleration of how our sociological interactions seem to be accelerating, and it's absolutely driven, by technological tools that enable us to communicate.
And what about 2012 specifically? I mean, do you think Terence was just off, or was maybe some kind of portal opened up in that year and perhaps we didn't see it?
There are some real fascinating theories about 2012, and one of my very favorite, and I'm going to paraphrase it badly, and it's my favorite for entertainment purposes. So you folks at home, don't worry about this. One of my favorite theories was that 2012 did happen, and so we're now in a post 2012 dream that is we're possibly rewinding. But in my experience, being a sentient creature here on Earth, being a humanoid here on the planet, it feels like 2012 is still unraveling, and the ramifications of that are still profoundly affecting our acceleration in culture. And again, high strangeness being a predominant cultural marker, and for sociologists describe cultural markers as facets of a culture that individuals identify with. And so a cultural marker of the LGBTQ community, the Great LGBTQ Alliance, is a cultural marker, and it's an identifier. And I have since since the late 70s, early 80s, I've essentially ascribed to the cultural marker of strangeness, of high weirdness, and it continues to accelerate, and more of us are coming online, so to speak. So 2012, yeah, I think 2012 was indeed an event. An old hillbilly friend of mine, Ricky Bob Barclay, used to call it the if this might be before your time, but during the 2012 phenomena, there was also a subphenomena known as the harmonic convergence. Yeah. And the harmonic convergence was another omega point leading up to 2012. So, of course, my old buddy from the Ozarks, Ricky Bob Barclay, he called it the harmonic coincidence. And he was, he was more correct than you realized, because high strangeness, the acceleration of our culture, is all deeply interwoven with synchronicity or meaningful coincidence. Right. And so as we observe and participate in it, we wrap ourselves more tightly in it.
Fascinating. And in terms of what comes next, I mean, do you believe, particularly, I mean, there's the cultural and the spiritual aspect. Obviously, AI seems to be getting really, really advanced, really fast, and it's the whole singularity piece of this. Do you think we're about to approach a singularity where it's unknowable what comes next, or do you have some idea of what unfolds in 10 years from now?
Right. And so, Werner Verge, is that his name? The guy who coined the term singularity, the technological singularity. His whole concept was the analogy of the singularity point in a black hole. And my layman's, I've read literature on it. I've written on it. I've talked about it. And it's typically been boiled down to a concept of the technological singularity being the point where artificial intelligence as a sentience surpasses the human ability. He also called that the end of the human era. And so it continues to wink at us, because the technologies, and especially with the incredible rise of artificial intelligence in the last decade or two, really points to it. And I've outlined and showcased some very strange versions of what artificial intelligence and the singularity really mean in some of my writings. It's on my weblog. You can find it on technostics.com. But I think that the technological singularity is a event that is looming. I don't, there's a lot of, and you are probably more familiar with this than I, but, there are there's a school of thought that, within computer science, that there's absolutely no way that machine intelligence can surpass human intelligence in the scope and depth of the human experience. The example being, artificial intelligence doesn't have a sense of humor.
Right.
It's too sophisticated. Humor is too sophisticated a mode of intelligence transfer to really be duplicated. So there's that school of thought, which I adhere to that. I think that makes a lot of sense. There's also the school of thought that the technological singularity is already here, and we're already in the grips of it, which I additionally agree with. Yeah. I feel strongly both ways.
I like it. And I definitely want to come back to the humor point. Humor, as I heard you in another podcast mention, humor is the great weapon against bureaucracy, I believe, which I love that. But in terms of, just one last point on the singularity thing, I mean, past whatever, I don't know, this next decade of technological high strangeness unfolding looks like, do you think, are we as sort of biological, apes that also have some connection to the new sphere? Are we still here? Are we, completely ethereal beings past this? Or do you have any view, or do you think it's just impossible to know?
I think that the biggest entanglement for humanity is really just the small but consequential effect that we have on the planet's biosphere. So, and I want to take a step back, if you'll indulge me for a moment.
Please.
Before we came online, we talked about Teilhard de Chardin.
Yes.
He had a very interesting concept, and this goes to the name of my newest book, The Brave New World, with the word "new" being spelled N-O-O rather than N-E-W. And excuse me, that term was coined by Teilhard de Chardin, and he described the new sphere as the omega point of human thought, and he envisioned humanity as a whole, as a sphere of a biosphere, just like the atmosphere, as a sphere of the planet, as an integral component of the planet, with humanity being the eyes of the world, if you will, along with the other species. There's other sentient species on the planet. They just aren't as problematic as the the domesticated primates.
Right.
So the new sphere, or the information sphere, Teilhard de Chardin kind of intermingled those concepts, and I'm paraphrasing rather badly about his very astute theories. By the way, he was a Jesuit priest and a paleontologist and a heretic. The Catholic Church frowned on his views. Unlike, very similar to the Gnostics of old. So the new sphere is a component of humanity, collective humanity. And I know you'll probably want to talk about that a little bit in a bit. That is a very real function of the planet, and the residual effect of humanity's technologies are beginning to impact the planet as a whole, and throwing off our planetary equilibrium. There's a lot of people who don't believe in climate change, but there's some of us who have experienced it firsthand. You and I, living on the West Coast, we've seen the devastation of a increased fire season.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, the fire season lasted a month, and nowadays it's all summer. Right. Smoke in the valleys. And so we're seeing it, and on the East Coast, it's increased hurricane activity. So the planet is definitely being impacted by the problematic primates. So that would be wherein humanity is running amiss. But I also am very optimistic and very I'm very optimistic in the survivability of humanity, because we have a creative component, an artistic creative component within us that, as it blossoms in a collective, becomes a very powerful force that is, I think, beneficial to the planet.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I tend to agree with you. As I mentioned, I have my various ventures operating under the sort of moniker hive mind for a reason, and that's kind of where I view humanity going. Do you think it's fair to say, and by the way, I don't think it's just a hive mind of humanity, right? I think the new sphere, if it includes all information in sort of the mental realm, soon will include quote unquote artificial life too, which is cool or great in my mind. And who knows, maybe we'll find ways to translate, what the dolphins are saying and link up with them as well. Do you think as we form this hive mind, that it's just going to be like such a different, I don't know, almost phase jumper, like just such a different, like do you have any idea or any words to describe what that, completely linked up hive mind might look or feel like, or do you think that's beyond the realm of words?
I would say this. I would say that, one of the facets of humanity, humans are tool builders, but they're also model builders. We like to create models, including conceptual models. And so I think that the rise of of the computer revolution and the rise of the internet, the World Wide Web, was a fascinating early model of the hive mind, as you describe it. And it was that our first, attempt at connecting globally and sharing the collective through individual communicative nodes, the PC, and now the mobile phone. I have an iPhone. It's kind of an antiquated. It's an SE. It has more computing power than the Apollo missions had.
Yeah.
So
do I, by the way.
Anyway, I digress. Where were we?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's just very interesting to try and sort of, every model is of course wrong, but some are useful. And, just trying to understand what that's going to feel like. I mentioned to you as we got on the podcast, and as many of the listeners know, I mean, that's very much kind of a lot of the mission of the Nostr community as well, is, which, by the way, I think an interesting synchronicity that Nostr sounds a whole lot like Gnostic. And
yes,
I think
it's a happy coincidence.
A happy coincidence. And I think, that's one of the things actually I love about Nostr is it's very much a community. It's very, based around the idea of DIY. You can create your own identity permissionlessly. You publish your identity. You bring it with you permissionlessly. And I think in many ways, we are quote unquote tool builders as well, that want a free flow of information. I think I described to you with sort of the Bitcoin payments that we have. I view that as energy backed money. So to me, what I see that forming as is a form of, digital metabolism. So now you've got like an energy-backed representation forming metabolism. You've got this free flow of information, but as long as it's stored on enough different relays or servers in the system, there's always a checkpoint that you could go back to earlier in the system, which starts to sound a lot like how DNA and evolution works biologically. And so, I think that's what we're hoping is we're going to build a version of this hive mind that allows nature, the Tao, whatever you want to call it, that's driving this to do its thing.
Right, and it's interesting. One of the relatively obscure authors that I point to in Brave New World was the science fiction author Philip K. Dick, and he had some very interesting ideas, specifically about DNA as essentially just being memory coils, and his thinking on it. And this was after his own Gnostic experience. He had a revelatory psychedelic experience in the late 70s that really shaped the rest of his career. For those of your listeners who don't know Philip K. Dick, he was a kind of a pulp science fiction author whose books became huge blockbusters at the turn of the century in terms of Hollywood. Like Blade Runner was a Philip K. Dick adaptation. There was 4 or 5 that I listed in the book. He viewed DNA as essentially a binary system of memory coils, the ability to read of which had been lost by humanity. And the idea of gnosis or intuitively derived knowledge was the ability to regain the reading of the memory coils. And so it's no coincidence that the technologies that you're seeing kind of remind you of DNA in a sense, because it is a incredible memory retrieval system. The DNA system is an incredible memory retrieval system anyway. And we like to model our world, and another facet of culture, another facet of humanity's survival, which I view very optimistically, is a feature of humanity known as the workaround. And humans are very creative, and we adapt rather quickly. And whenever we run into a snag or a snafu, we find a workaround. So that is a component of humanity that I think is going to continue to serve us well.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's interesting to me when you talk about gnosis being a way of reading the memory coils. I love that analogy. I think it's really nice. How do you think about, I've often, I'm not as deep with his work, but Chardin and the new sphere, you know, in some ways it seems like we have that forming with information in our technology systems today, the internet, stuff like Nostr. On the other hand, I've obviously heard of things like Akashic records or the ability to just intuitively, get whatever is out there. There's also, I guess, this idea that, you have discoveries that all happen around the world at the same time. And maybe it's sort of already out there in the ether, so to speak. Do you think those are different and they're just happening in different dimensions? Are they the same thing? What is the difference between those versions of the news sphere?
Yeah, if we talk about dimensionality, then it becomes a little bit more entangling. However, I do believe, as did Carl Jung, the World War II era psychologist who was the founder of Jungian psychology. He was a very strong believer in synchronicity. He utilized the I Ching as a inspirational tool, and he believed that cutting edge ideas were indeed floating in this. Essentially, I'm dumbing this down a little bit, but we're essentially in the noosphere, in the atmosphere, and that receptive individuals could pull that down and utilize it. And so
Right.
so it's not a mere coincidence or even a sheer coincidence that ideas are discovered in plural form
Yeah, no, I
rather
love
than
that.
singular.
And the name of this pod, Ideas from the Edge. We're trying to go out there and catch those ideas if we can.
You bet.
Cool. Something else I wanted to touch on, perhaps just being a bit more practical, for people sort of in their day-to-day lives. You've got all of this sort of accelerating high strangeness and, technologies getting crazier and crazier. And I guess a two-part question to you. One is, it's rare for me, and this is something that I actually personally would very much value, to meet someone like yourself who sees, quote unquote, so much. You seem to see a lot of the different dimensions of all of this and yet remain so optimistic. So number one, I mean, it's easy, I feel like, for a lot of people to get caught into like, oh man, like things are changing too fast. There's doom scrolling and all this. So part one of my question is, how do you remain optimistic? And then part two is just tactically speaking, something I go back and forth with that optimism is the answer to kind of ride the beast faster, Terrence McKenna style, build these technological systems with self-sovereignty like we're trying to do in Nostr, or as you, and I think this was a Philip K. Dick quote, highlight in your book, find the Buddha in the park, which I take for just like shut the screens, go out into nature and like live a peaceful, non-brainwashed life. How do you like balance those two tactics?
So both very important, and the Buddha in the park, and I appreciate you pointing that out. That's a very obscure point in the book, but it's something that it's a practice that I have pursued my whole life, and so the two components of that is the park, which is in I take that globally as the environment, the natural world, and the idea of going out in nature and leaving the phone in the car, leaving the car behind, and getting on that trail and walking out and finding a sweet spot to watch the sunset. And that is a real nice way to become in tune with Gaia, with
Right.
Mother Nature, the great feminine principle. And so, yeah, that's the park. The park is our incredible natural environment. But the other component is the Buddha, and the Buddha is the enlightened one, of course, from Buddhism, but we're all Buddha.
Mm.
And so just finding the ability to calm your mind is essentially entering the park. So a meditative practice is entering the park. Um, Humans are really weird in the sense that we have this animated, suspended animated life, right? So we're animated for 12 to 18 hours a day walking around, but then we go into a hibernation for 6 to 8 hours and we sleep. Well, when we do that, we're entering the park, and the
Mm.
experience of that, of course, is dream time. And
Mm.
so the ability to enter the park is the ability to turn off the external and allow the internal to recharge. And it's important to do that, right? So we sleep during our spin cycle on the planet, right? So we sleep, and some of us sleep more, some of us sleep less. However, we are recharging and regenerating the creative ability, right? And so the Buddha in the park allows us to continually renew and become new again. And so my optimism stems from just the amazing continuation of creativity that humanity demonstrates. And there's plenty of facets of stupidity to point to, of course, but it's counterbalanced by creativity. And the great post World War II religion, probably the greatest religion to emerge after World War II, which in fact was a parody religion, was the religion of Discordianism. And in that religion, the Discordians believed that the great dichotomy, the great yin yang of the Eastern religions, the great dichotomy in Discordianism is the eternal balance and struggle between humorousness and seriousness. The Discordians would say, "Hey, don't take the world too serious." And so I subscribe to Discordianism. I also I like that dichotomy being viewed in the filter of seriousness versus humorousness. And if you don't have a sense of humor, it's just not funny.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great.
I also consider humor to be a highly evolved sign of intelligence.
Yeah, no, I mean, please say more on that. I mean, I'm very interested in your point about the AIs having a challenge or struggling to mimic humor or understand humor, and also this idea that I think, like we mentioned before, humor is the great weapon against bureaucracy. Yeah, what exactly do you mean by that?
Humor has always been a instrument of counter terror. And so if in this world, it goes back to that dichotomy. And we have since the biblical times, we've really been driven by, warring factions of desert religious ideology. The three main desert religious tribes who flourished since the biblical times, of course, was Christianity, Buddhism, and Judaism. And they're essentially just, patrilineal warring factions. And so we've kind of been stuck with that patriarchy for 2,000 years. And the counterinsurgency to that is, you could point to matriarchy, but I really just think of it as more of as a natural emergence of the feminine principle. And that component has always utilized creativity, art, music, humor as the weapon of choice in the counterinsurgency against the seriousness of the patriarchy. And so humor has been driven as a incredibly effective tool. Again, I go into it briefly in the book, but back in the contentious days of the 1960s, there was a lot of political protest and the protests against the Vietnam War, the rise of the civil rights with Dr. King, and the rise of feminism and women's lib in the 60s and 70s. There were all these upsurgence of a broader understanding of what humanity could be. And all of these factions utilized humor as a component as a delivery system for the counterinsurgency. So, for instance, during the Vietnam War, the student protests, there was a faction known as the Yippies, and they were a political arm of the hippie movement, and they always used music and humor as a device to disarm the argumentative and serious patrilineal predominant paradigm. One of the great clowns of that era, his name was Wavy Gravy. He always dressed as a clown, literally, and not the scary kind, from It, but a happy clown. And he was asked once, "Well, why do you dress like a clown?" And Wavy Gravy thought about it for a second, and he responded, "Well, when I dress like a clown, the cops won't hit me."
Yeah.
And so humor is very disarming, and it's very effective.
This is kind of a random thought that just popped up, but you see this sort of the clown archetype, I guess the jester, which is a beautiful and valuable role, in society, to be able to, to say the king has no clothes and be funny about it and not get hurt.
Sure.
I don't know, maybe this is a little out there, but like, it seems like that archetype keeps reforming over and over. Do you think that archetype has some relation to quote unquote creative beings in other dimensions, maybe like the Terrence McKenna machine elves, or it seems like people that have had perhaps psychedelic experiences have described interacting with jester or clown type beings? That might be kind of out there, but do you think there's some relationship at all?
I think the jester is a very ancient and powerful archetype. And again, back to Carl Jung, the psychologist. Jung really spearheaded the whole utilization of the archetype as a psychological model, and so the clown archetype is a very deep, very ancient, very old archetype that we return to, and it's got a cutting head. It's a two-edged sword, because on one level it has a creative naivete, but on the other level it demonstrates egregious ignorance.
Yeah.
So it's a balance, But the jester and the fool has always been attributed and associated very closely with the trickster mythos archetype. And the trickster, of course, is the archetype that brings knowledge to humanity. So, for instance, you are probably familiar with the Greek myth of Prometheus, who steals fire from the gods, steals fire from Zeus. That's a trickster archetype, right? And he stole fire from the gods and brought it to humanity. And so that is the nature of the trickster, but consequently, he gets burned by his own accomplishment. So, it's a two-edged sword, but it's a deep myth that we continue to utilize.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. And in terms of humor, another area that I wanted to touch on that you mentioned in your book is the power of memes, memetics, and meme magic. You specifically reference this, in the case of social media. You talk about it a lot in the case of, memes being a big part of the reason that, Trump was successful in the 2016 campaign. And I'm sure in lots of other areas as well, and a lot of I've always thought it's funny that even though I don't necessarily enjoy all of these memes, some of them can be in fact quite cruel, but they're effective. The whole Pepe the Frog and, these kind of weird sort of as I call them, anon tastemakers on 4chan, then break out on the internet and seem to go viral. What is your thought on what's going on there? Is that using humor? Is it a darker form of humor? What's going on there?
So first of all, yes, I do believe that the memetics can be transmitted very effectively with humor, because we all love that. We're all on there and we laugh at that, right?
Right.
It's fun. And memetics is very interesting because the whole idea of the meme, it was coined. The term meme was coined as an analogy, using the analogy of the gene, right? Mm-hmm. So it is essentially a mind virus that transmits information. And so, meme magic was very interesting. And, I would just point out, and I get into it just a little bit in the book, but it's worth talking about because of the nature of our politics currently. If, for those of us who are sadistic enough to follow politics, meme magic was, I believe, was very influential in leading up to the 2016 presidential election. And it wasn't so much Donald Trump per se as it was the denizens of 4chan and 8chan who were recognizing the meaningful coincidence, back to that concept, of the gets of all these strings of numbers that would show up being associated with Donald Trump and or Pepe the Frog. And it did take in my estimation, it did take a dark turn. I thought it was kind of strange for Pepe to be wearing a swastika and reading Mein Kampf, and so there was a dark element of that, but that was also very prophetic. Yeah. It turns out. However, so the denizens of 4chan and 8chan, they were predicting that Trump was going to win the election driven by the memetic magic that they were experiencing online. And he did win that election. Now, interestingly, those same denizens of 4chan and 8chan also pointed out that those gets were not showing up in the 2020 election. And so that stream, that flow of energy, that flow of meme magic dissipated.
And yeah, could you maybe say a bit more on that? Like how does this magic go from these like kind of obscure corners of the internet? And, I would argue probably most people, unless it's a subconscious thing, are probably not going to be at least consciously swayed. Oh, I'm going to vote one way because I see, a Pepe the Frog in some kind of ridiculous configuration. But maybe so. And if so, why did that lose in 2020? And is it coming back in 2024? Or what was at stake in 2016? What was different?
So that representative flow, and it's not always easily discernible, the nature or the extent of the flow, but it definitely does. And I believe in observation of our planet. I believe in the ebb and flow of energy, as well as the ebb and flow of the seasons, the ebb and flow of the tides, the ebb and flow of lifespans. And so that's kind of a environment in which we live. And so, yeah, the memetics around Pepe and around the Trumpian insurgency, we'll use that term, it definitely peaked in 2016, but as all waves do, as all, a classic example of the ebb and flow of an energy is a bell curve, right? And so it amassed and it went up and then it dissipated and it flowed back down. And so, yeah, I do believe that flow will continue if we were able to predict where and when that flow reoccurs. That would be a thing.
Yeah,
that would be a thing.
Information. Well, no, please go for it.
Oh, so to just expand a little bit more on the whole idea of meme magic as a instrument, that's tied to chaos magic, and it's tied to the magical thinking in general, and that is the interface between technology and epiphany. The idea of magic being used as a technology, and it's driven by the adherence, the recognition, and the adherence of synchronicity. So let's remember, synchronicity it's a force that is atemporal. Synchronicity is not driven by time or effect. It's driven by intention and by the interface between humanity, right, and recognition. So magic is driven in a great part by synchronous events, but it's driven by the intention of the practitioner. So in that regard, it's a technology. So, a meditation is a very powerful magical force, because you are setting an intention of calming yourself, or or of quieting the mind. That's a very powerful intention. And so chaos magicians, memetic engineers, they take that they take that intention and they focus it out uh, uh, in a meaningful way. And so magicians have always used their intention to bring about their reality. Before you can observe it, you must first think it. And so magic always begins in the mind and in the heart and the soul. And so, humans, humanity and the body is really a phenomenal um, um, entity, right? And modern science tells us now that that the mind is not merely the brain, but it's a network of the brain, the heart, and the gut, right? Because they find neurons, they find synaptic activity in all three of those components, driven throughout the body. So in that regard, the ancient technology of the chakra system is very in tune with how the modern description of the mind body works. Mm-hmm. And I get into that in utilizing Timothy Leary's 8-brain model in my previous trilogy, the Technostics trilogy, and I get into that a little bit. But it is definitely a foundational mechanism of intention. And so that's so I see meme magic as being a continuation of that more ancient chaos magic, which was actually not that ancient. That was 70s, 80s chaos magic became big, but the idea of magical practice has been with us as long as religion has been with us.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Timothy Leary chakra map. I also am a big fan of Robert Anton Wilson, and one of his books, Prometheus Rising, is probably one of my favorite books. That really just blew my mind when I read it. And it's interesting to me now. I had not made this connection before. And that book, for those of you who aren't aware, it's fascinating. Goes over this kind of 8 chakra, or whatever he calls them, circuit model from Timothy Leary. But he also, it's interesting the title. To your point, Prometheus, right? So this kind of the jester or the trickster archetype, bringing fire, knowledge, whatever, to humanity, which I guess in many ways he kind of was, or maybe collectively we're all becoming that. I don't know.
Right. Well, it's interesting, I share your enthusiasm for the works of Robert Anton Wilson. And so his overlay, he of course was a big friend and a big fan of Tim Leary, who was one of the fathers of the Western psychedelic tradition. And so, Leary came up with the 24 brain, or more simplified version, the 8-brain model of psychology, which overlaid with the seven chakra system. In fact, Leary ripped off the whole 8-brain model from some ancient tantric texts that were made available to him back in Millbrook when he was living on the East Coast, right after he got kicked out of Harvard. But Robert Anton Wilson was very informative in bringing that model to the world. He, of course, in turn, was friends with the authors and the creators of Discordianism. So it's a tangled web. Yeah, it's a tangled web of weirdness. Once we start unraveling it, it's fine. The great naturalist John Muir. He said, once you start poking at a thing, you realize that it's hitched to everything else in the universe. Yeah. And so that's the deeper we go, the faster we go, the rounder we get.
Oh, I like that. Faster we go, the rounder we get. One other thing I wanted to touch on with the meme magic stuff, something that I had told you just a bit about before we hopped on this call, and something I just wanted to highlight because I know a lot of our listeners will probably have seen this recently. With the power of sort of open protocols, so Nostr in our case for identity and information, Bitcoin for value, Lightning Network for payments, I'm really excited because we've seen just last week the first example of an idea going from completely just a question to manifesting in reality, turning from potential to kinetic energy. And, what I mentioned there was with the banning of Twitter in Brazil, someone had recently put up a billboard for Nostr in a kind of like fun, gestury way, I would say. And I remember I just asked a question. I was actually talking to my girlfriend about it, and she raised, "Why isn't anyone doing this in Brazil?" And I said, "That's a great question." I then, noted that out to the whole community, tagged a crowdfunding project that works on all kinds of projects like this. The next day, they had a project up. Within 3 days, we had raised over $2,000, and the billboard is now going up. And so, to me, this is something that's really interesting to me. Is in the past, social media and memes in general have been powerful at changing minds and certainly organizing people. But now that we're adding on potentially new layers of permissionless, open, funding as well, I think the ability for meme magic and social media to shape the physical world is going to be exponentially higher, and for both good and bad ways. But I think it's going to be really fun and interesting to watch.
And that was a very exciting development, and it's very poignant, and it speaks to the optimistic side of evolution. And I would just point out, and again, you can refresh my memory. It was a billboard that you saw that was posted. Where was it?
Yeah, so obviously Nostr is just a protocol, and our kind of like unofficial mascot is the ostrich. So
nice,
kind of fun. And their Spiral, which is a sort of open source group that funds open source development around both Bitcoin and now Nostr, had done a hack day, and they put out a whole bunch of different ideas. It's interesting to trace the whole chain of ideas. They put out 20 different samples of like, hey, if someone wanted to put up a billboard to advertise Nostr, here's 20 different ideas that we have. Well, one guy who's just a guy in Nostr, a guy on the internet, thought it was cool, paid for it himself, and put up for 1 week one of those images in, I don't know if it was Amsterdam or somewhere else in the Netherlands. And mostly just because it seemed fun. And I saw that, and it got a little bit of traction on Nostr, people talking about it, being like, hey, this is pretty cool. And then when I was discussing with my girlfriend, we're like, well, wait a second, this is great and it's fun, but wouldn't this make a whole lot more sense in Brazil, where people are currently being, thrust off of Twitter and looking for an alternative? And so I just asked the simple question. I looked around, I couldn't find anyone doing it. I just said, is anyone doing this? And tagged, 4 or 5 different people in this one, company, Geyser, which works on crowdfunding. And then the next day the project was up. I said, okay, cool, I'll contribute. Who else is going to contribute? And then within 3 days, we had exceeded our goal, and now
that's beautiful.
Billboard up. Yeah,
that's beautiful. So that event, right? That was the cosmic trigger, right? That moment when you saw that, your consciousness saw that Amsterdam, the information from Amsterdam popped up. It put a thought in your mind, and that triggered a chain of events, or maybe for entertainment purposes, we'll call it a blockchain of events. That triggered a social movement, which is a classic example of a decentralized insurgency. Love it, right? Yeah, that's the workaround. That's the workaround. That's how we get around the paradigm, the dominator culture that we deal with on a daily basis. We continually have to render unto Caesar Caesar's due, to use a biblical Gnostic term. But
love it.
But at the same time, we work around it.
Yeah.
So,
no, I couldn't agree more. And I thought actually I would love maybe for you just to mention a bit about this idea of the open source insurgency. Because Nostr, our whole community is based around everything: open data, open code, and basically just more transparency and remixability for everything. And so I had never heard that phrase before, but the moment I heard open source insurgency, I'm like, God, that's exactly what we are.
Right.
Yeah, but we'd love to hear what that means to you, or how you came up with
that. It kind of has an odd beginnings, at least for me, because it kind of it utilizes militaristic terms, right? An insurgency, it's a kind of a guerrilla event, which the subtitle of my book is A Guerrilla Ethnography of High Strangeness. So an insurgency is a tactic used typically by guerrillas who utilize guerrilla warfare in resistance to a invading dominator's paradigm. right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is a counterbalance, or it's a counter strike to a bureaucracy, right? An insurgency typically is a inroad that um, that seeks to diminish the grip of a bureaucratic system. You know,
Mm.
bureaucracies are slow, and they're slow to change, but they have a hardened structure.
Mm-hmm.
A disruptive insurgency is it's nimble, it's small and it's nimble, and it has the way to work around the uh, defensive mechanisms of the bureaucracy. So that's kind of a snapshot of how I view a disruptive insurgency.
Yeah, and I love this idea also when you kind of well, there's two ideas I want to hit on there, but one is this idea of the bureaucracy as the enemy, or I don't even know if enemy is the right word, but you talk about Philip K. Dick saying blows against the empire, and what exactly is the empire? The empire never ended, or whatever it is from Rome until now. And I like this idea that it's not that there's like some necessarily big boogeyman or even one particular company or government or economic system, but this idea that bureaucracy, just something that's like where intelligence is too far from the edge, so that the participants on the edge are clearly seeing it's ridiculous the way things are working, and it's not in their best interest or the best interest of really anyone except for the people at the center, and even the people at the center are probably not even in their best interest in the long run. What do you mean by this idea with bureaucracy, and why is it so stifling for us now? Is that just the stage of evolution we're at, and the future will need new bureaucracy, and then we'll need to disrupt it, and so forth forever?
Yeah, bureaucracies essentially is the codification or the cementing of a previously creative dynamic system, right? And
Mm.
so something new and wonderful gets created, and sooner or later, its very success um, begins to grow a shell of orthodoxy around it, and that's the bureaucratic system. And the intention may arguably may have been well intended, but the very nature of putting a bureaucratic structure on any living entity acts to essentially kind of finish it off.
Yeah, I love
And
that.
so bureaucracy is just it's also human nature. It it aligns with the great Discordian dynamic of seriousness. If you've ever met the ultimate bureaucrat, they don't have a sense of humor. It's
Exactly.
all dry. Well, it's not funny. This isn't funny. This is serious. And so insurgencies, by their very nature, have a playful, creative component to them, and it takes a creative mind to come up with the workaround, right? So we got to get around the bureaucratic orthodoxy. We have to be creative in our decentralized insurgency.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely, absolutely great. Um, Another kind of like general philosophical point that I wanted to touch on with you is, you're obviously deeply involved or influenced by Gnosticism. I don't know if you would consider yourself a Gnostic or not. Um, how does this idea of Gnosticism and direct experience do you compare with some of the more, Eastern spiritual traditions like Buddhism and also having direct experience? Are they just different ways of saying the same thing to you, or do you see them as somewhat different?
So I want to speak just for a minute about the biblical era Gnostics. So that the biblical era Gnostics, pre-biblical and biblical times, they were essentially a precursor to Christianity. They were a mystical sect. I view Gnosticism as the mystical arm of Christianity, just
Mm,
as I view Sufism as the mystical arm of Islam,
interesting.
right? And so the Gnostics, they got during after the great Gnostic Jesus was taken out, they began to codify or turn the living teachings of the Gnostics into a codified religion. And so the first the first factions of that codified religion that had to go were the Gnostics, right? They could not. The Gospels, the Gnostic Gospels, were the first to get kicked out of the canonized Christian doctrine of the Bible. So the Gospel according to Mary Magdalene, of course, that had to go. The Gospel of Thomas had to go because the Gnostics they had the heretical notion that you did not need a priesthood to achieve gnosis, to achieve that true knowledge of the God above gods, as they described, the oneness of the universe. And so that, the founding fathers of the church, they couldn't have that. So the Gnostics had to go. So Gnosticism, they had some very creative and very novel concepts. And one of the most eloquent concepts of the early Gnostics was that the fall of humanity was not a fall. It was not a factor of humans. The Christian church taught that humans basically fell from grace by virtue of original sin. The whole Garden of Eden mythology is a mythology of the fall from grace. That's when God kicked the humans out of the garden. The Buddha remains in the park, besides what the Christians will tell you. So the Gnostics held the heretical view that humanity did not fall. It was not human error that created the horrors of the world. It was actually a deformed, deranged creator god known as the demiurge that was the genesis of all of the sorrow of an otherwise perfect universe. And the demiurge was a fallen middle management creator trickster image archetype, right? The demiurge, or the Christians called him Jehovah. But he was a deranged god who thought that he was the only god. He was a faction of a fallen faction of the higher god above gods, but he thought he was the only one. And his one of his most famous quotes is, "Thou shalt have no other god unto me," right? And so he was basically saying, I am the creator, and you shall have no other allegiance but to me. And so the Christians, they believe that, and they utilize the idea of the fall of man or original sin to support that reality. Whereas the Gnostics said, no, it's not humans. Humans indeed have a spark of the divine within each soul. It was the mythology and the structure derived by a deranged god, middle management god known as the demiurge, that is the source of all pain and suffering, which was a very eloquent way of looking at of all of the pain and suffering in the world today. It's driven by a deranged god. A deranged god will beget a deranged world. And when I say the world, I'm talking about the material world.
Right. Interesting. I mean, there's so much there. What is your take on that? I mean, if that is the case, do you not think that the source god, why do you think the source god would allow something like that to happen? Or is that just part of the play? You need this guy, whether he's a trickster or also when you call middle management, that evokes the idea of a bureaucrat to me. Is that necessary for the cosmic game to play out?
It is the whole idea of the mythologies around Christianity, and for that matter, the mythologies around Buddhism and Islam, they're stories. I mean, humans also, we are tool builders. We're also storytellers. We love to tell each other stories. So on one level, God was created by humans when we were telling each other the story of creation. How did we get here? And so the idea of the demiurge was a creation myth that also took into account, it was another telling of the great yin-yang, or the great feminine masculine dichotomy. And so it's symbolic. It's a mythology that's symbolic of the dichotomy between masculine and feminine energy. And so the fall from grace occurred as a as a fall of two of the aeons they're described as, which were primordial energies. And they typically were paired in masculine and feminine forms. The feminine form was known as Sophia. That's the Greek word for wisdom, who can be described as the creatrix of the world, or as I'd like to think of her, Mother Nature, right? The feminine facet of the material world was known as Sophia. And her counterpart was her only begotten son, who was the demiurge, who was birthed by Sophia, but saw himself as the true and only God, when in reality, he was part of a dichotomy of a fallen higher power, of the God above gods. So all of those mythologies really are just a retelling of the great plus minus yin yang male female dichotomy of manifest universe.
Yeah.
And if you really want to know the truth, I'm just kidding.
No, please. Yeah. Well, I guess, a follow-up question, which I suppose perhaps kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, but I guess the one question that all of this kind of then always links back to for me, and maybe the answer is just a sense of humor, or, the Douglas Adams answer, but like, in your mind, why something instead of nothing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, the idea of materiality, has an underlying sense of dichotomy, right? The manifest versus the unmanifest, and so the balance of the feminine with the balance of the masculine is probably a reasonable facsimile of the nature of materiality. And interestingly, the whole dichotomy of the yin and yang is mirrored in the DNA. The double helix nature of the DNA, as well as the plus minus 0-1 dichotomy of the binary system of computer technology, right? So they all are just a retelling of that primordial dichotomy. And so science likes to think of it as the Big Bang, which is kind of cool. I mean, it carries a certain, dramatic air about it. But the true genesis, hard to say. But I feel like we're still writing it, whatever that was.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Jack, I know we've been out for a while. One last area that I wanted to just ask you about. I don't even know if this is in your wheelhouse or not. It was in the book, but I feel like it might be. I have, over the last year or two, increasingly been interested in going down the rabbit hole of sort of ancient civilizations and some of the Graham Hancock, Howard Crowhurst thinking that there was probably very advanced civilizations farther back in history than we realize, and perhaps they had some discrete knowledge.
Sure.
Are you? Yeah. Do you have any take on any of that stuff? Do you believe that perhaps we've already lived this version of reality before, and we're just playing it out again and again and again, and we keep having selective amnesia and forgetting that, or no?
Well, I'm gonna steer away from the higher dimensional ramifications of that question, and I would just simply go, since you mentioned Hancock, I would simply just go to the simple fact that the biologists tell us that the human brain has been very much the same for well over 200,000 years, probably much more. And so the idea that we suddenly came up with the concept of civilization 5,000 years ago, it's kind of a stretch, and you look at what many of the anthropologists consider remnant civilizations, like the Mayan ruins and the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, the mythology of Lemuria in Mount Shasta.
Yeah.
Right? The Lemurians who lived in the mountain, or the Atlanteans, right? So all of these mythologies point to a metaphor that is very accessible to all of us, which would simply be, civilizations rise and fall. We've seen it within recorded history. The rise and fall of the Romans, the rise and the impending fall of the Western democratic process, right? So we see that dichotomy, and it absolutely is reasonable to assume that there have been the rise and fall of great technological cultures prior to the 20,000 or so years that we can reach back to with with our current archaeological understanding.
Yeah, no, I mean
Right.
that
What? And
I mean,
Hancock did the book about the ancient Americas, claiming
yeah, I've got it
claiming
right now. I'm reading
ancient.
it.
What's that?
I'm reading it.
Oh, all right. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So right. So um, the the idea of such it makes sense, right? It makes
Yeah.
sense. It kind of sits right.
One thing that I'll mention there that could be of interest to you, we have, as I mentioned, we kind of see having multiple data stores across multiple servers in Nostr.
Sure.
Some of this redundancy is very interesting because one of the, I guess, I don't know if this is like quote unquote codified or said, but it's certainly felt among the community. One of our goals is to, as best we can, prevent selective amnesia from happening. And I think we see amnesia all over, like the internet. Lots of web pages are getting deleted really quickly. I don't think a lot of people realize how limited Google search is right now versus other means of search. I think that potentially, if we did have these great civilizations that have risen and fallen, it's a real shame that we've forgotten all of the knowledge and gone through that cycle of darkness. Although maybe it's necessary, but one of the projects that's really cool right now in Nostr is a project called Project Alexandria, which of course is reference to Library of Alexandria. And the idea is very much how can we try and incentivize and bring all of the world's knowledge that existing in books and on the internet, but also latent in humans as well, and try and get it into this open data store, which can be transferred openly, permissionlessly, as freely as possible, which in hopes of giving us the best chance of preserving that in perpetuity. So it's a cool project you might be interested in as well.
Well, that's great, and I'm sure you're familiar with one small internet enterprise that I've always been a big fan of, which was the Internet Archive.
Oh yeah, huge fan.
Right? And so the idea, interestingly, and we were talking about meme magic in 2016. Interestingly, with the outcome of the 2016 election, the Internet Archive cloned their databases and put them all on different computer networks across the planet because they didn't like the idea of being centrally located in the United States.
Smart, super smart, and that's part of the deal with Nostr as well. You want enough relays and enough different geographies that if one country decides to ban it, Singapore's still there or whoever's still there. So beautiful, Jack. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating, just wonderful conversation. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on or ask or get out there? Before I take too much of your time.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I would take a moment to plug the new book, A Brave New World, a guerrilla ethnography of high strangeness. And it has, again, it essentially acts as a historical documentation of just the odd occurrences that have led up to our current time. And it also affords some what I consider to be optimism about how we're moving forward. Groups and organizations such as yours demonstrate the nature and the power of decentralized, disruptive, insurgent energies, right? And as I call them, the workarounds, because that's the path forward, right? And oftentimes the technologies pre-exist the widespread understanding and usage of them, but it's important to be that cultural cultural progenitor, right, to get the next level of technology out there. Because again, the problematic primates, we're tool builders.
Yeah, no, I would second that. For anyone who's able to see this, Brave New World, which is a fabulous play on Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, but with the Chardin Noosphere spelled N-O-O. Excellent book. It's a quick read and definitely, one of the few books in the last couple of years that really spoke to me. And also your blog is techgnostics.com. Is that right?
Yeah, so my website is techgnostics.com, TEKGNOSTICS.com. And then I'm also at the Techgnostics blogspot, which is an old weblog that I continue to work on. But you can go to techgnostics.com, and then there's links to my various media outlets, Instagram. I have a author page on Amazon where you can find the Brave New World and my other books,
Awesome.
as well as my Reddit author page, etc. So,
Ooh,
yeah,
very nice.
I appreciate your interest in the book. I'm glad we had a chance to chat.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much, Jack.
All right. Take care.